So quickly again, I'm Graham Castleton, and I appreciate John's info here. So I'll be going through really a lot of hopefully very practical stuff about how to set up a wireless network, specifically wireless, but also talking a lot about just networks in general. And hopefully we're sending everybody home with all the tools and information you need to go and set up a network in your community. That's the goal, so hopefully we get there.
Questions at the end?
No, let's please raise your hand and ask questions, because if you have the question, somebody else probably does, and I'll end up skipping it, and we won't get there. So yeah, raise your hand, ask questions, and let's have a conversation as much as possible. But I think we will have time at the end for questions if you have something that comes up later. So we have several sessions throughout the conference. And so, we'll hit different topics at each time. The first thing I've got on the list, we talked about backhaul and getting internet service to your customers. How do you get the internet service that you can then give to your customers? That's the first thing we're going to talk about using my, you can tell I'm a artist, and that, this is something that I do, draw stick figures, but hopefully we can make it work. So we'll talk about that first. We're also going to talk a lot about wireless in general, how wireless works and how you can use it to build your networks out. A lot of hands-on stuff with how to actually put these things together and make them work together, and getting into things like if you want to go release space on a commercial tower, how do you do that, and who do you talk to, and what do you ask them, and that kind of thing. So we'll go through a lot of stuff over the next couple of days. But first, let's talk about backhaul and how to get internet service. I think we have until noon, and then we're going to have lunch. So just so we know where we're at. Okay, so I'm going to use my little whiteboard here and just draw at a really high level how kind of a wireless ISP internet network works. And again, with Althea, there's some more interesting things that can happen here. But just to get a really high level of kind of how your internet service provider works, I just wanted to start with that and make sure we're all on the same page. So we've got up in the clouds representing the internet. We talked a little bit about how these kind of work. If we, the internet isn't really just one big cloud out there; it's a bunch of clouds. We've got AT&T. I'm going to use a different thing here, and CenturyLink and Comcast and all these different internet service providers and internet networks, L3, and they all have connections to each other. Right? In different ways. And like we talked about earlier, those connections are mostly negotiated by people, and they're buying circuits from each other, they're paying each other to have connections. And then at some point, you as a homeowner or as a residential person or a business, you buy a connection from one of these companies, and then you're connecting through one of them, and they're connecting you out to everyone else, who's then letting you get to Facebook and Google and Reddit and all the other things that you use. So in order for our little home here to get internet service, they've got to get connected to something that has connections out to the rest of the internet. So again, today you might buy that from Comcast, and they sell you a connection that they have then brokered out to go to everybody. Our hope is that we get it through Althea, and we can start building these networks that mesh together, and that you won't have to pay Comcast anymore. But in order to do that, in order for you to go back and create this organization that's able to provide internet service, you've got to get your own connection to the internet. So that's the first thing that we're going to talk about. So a lot of the times the way that works is you're buying, the first thing that you do is buy, we've been calling it backhaul. You buy a leased connection, a high capacity connection to the internet. Usually it's on a fiber line. And sometimes you're buying that in a data center. Sometimes you're buying it at a commercial building. Maybe you can even get it in a residential area. And you're going to buy that, and then you're going to build the network out that will share that connection out into the community. So the way that might work here, you might purchase that line from AT&T, and you might get it to a commercial building in the area. A lot of times what happens is you're in a suburb or something, there's commercial buildings, and then it goes into suburbs, and you might buy a connection at the commercial area, part of the commercial part of town, and then you might start using wireless links to build that network out into the community where you'd like to provide service. That ends up happening a lot of the time. You might even buy a connection from somebody else at, say, a commercial tower. You see the big cell phone towers along the freeway. Those are available for leasing. We're going to talk about that, I think, tomorrow. And if it made sense for you and for your community to lease space on that tower, you could do that. You could purchase a connection there from somebody and start to build a network from that tower out into the community. And so, so following along with the wireless, once we had that, we're going to start building our wireless connection out into our community. You might put an access point up on your building here, and your community members could put little antennas up on their roof that would then connect wirelessly up to your access point, and that's how they would get service. So at a really high level, that's how this can work. We can start letting people expand these networks. In keeping with Althea, somebody else could purchase a connection here to this other building and create their own community over here with an access point. And in theory, these customers could decide which one to connect through, right? Based on price or based on speed or whatever factors are important to them. So we'll talk about this wireless stuff more in a little bit. Right now, the first thing I want to talk about is getting this fiber connection, the fiber connection to the upstream broader internet. That can be one of the trickier parts of making this work. It's kind of expensive, it takes a long time, and the sales process is pretty opaque. So in the US, the way that this works, and it's similar in other places, I'm just most familiar with the US, the way that this normally works is that you start calling a bunch of people, getting quotes, and they unfortunately will not give you all of the information that would be very helpful to be able to start doing this. So the way that it might work is you would drive through your community and find some areas that you guess might have fiber service. You can make good guesses based on you can ask the people. You go to a commercial building, and sometimes you can just go ask them, hey, do you have fiber service here? And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we have AT&T. Sometimes you can see the infrastructure. Sometimes you can go out, you can see their green pedestals sometimes that have AT&T's name on them. You can see the fiber equipment in there, or the fiber lines. That's a really good sign that there's service in there. I'm saying AT&T a lot, but it's not always AT&T. There's a lot of other providers that sell internet. Call it a lot of times it's called DIA, dedicated internet access, and there's other providers that sell this. You can get it. You can even get it from Comcast. You can get it from CenturyLink. There's companies like Zayo and L3, Hurricane Electric, Cogent, and a lot of times there are local providers as well that will sell it to you specifically, that are more local to your area. So finding a commercial building like that is great. It's very common at a commercial tower that there will be fiber, because Verizon and Sprint and T-Mobile are putting their equipment up there, and they need to have a fiber connection as well. So if it does make sense to you to go to a commercial tower, it's common that there will already be a fiber connection there that you can purchase. Or one of the most straightforward ways to do this, although not the cheapest, is to go to a data center. So there are a lot of data centers. Places like Digital Realty have data centers all over the place, but in most areas where there's some kind of a commercial center, there might be a data center nearby, and you can rent a cabinet in the data center, and then they will always have internet service there that you can purchase directly from them. And most of the time, they'll work with you on allowing you to put equipment up on the roof that you can then.
Could you expand a little bit more on what you would ask for as far as cabinetry and
Yeah.
roof access and what
Yeah.
the conversation might be like?
Yep. So the question here about data centers, going in and asking a data center to rent, and what do you ask for, is getting a cabinet, and there's a bunch of different stuff that goes into that. So yeah, let's talk about that for any questions. Well, let me answer this question. I won't get that. Okay, so if you're going to look at a data center, if that's what makes sense for you, there's several things to look at. Usually, what you'll do is purchase some cabinet space. That means you get either a whole rack in their data center somewhere, or sometimes you can purchase part of a rack. And you're leasing that monthly, usually, and that includes basically just the space and maybe power to power up your stuff. In most cases, actually, as an ISP, you probably won't have very much stuff in that rack. You might just have your one server device running the Althea software, and that might be it. So if you run a whole rack, you'll have one U in use and the rest empty. That's not uncommon. You might put some battery backups in there, but usually the data center provides their own backup power, and it's usually sufficient. So you probably aren't putting all that much in there. The things you will need to work out with them, though, if you are going to purchase fiber service from them, usually they'll have an array of providers that you can purchase from. So they might have 3 to 5 carriers in the data center, and you can purchase internet service from any or all of them. So you'll work that out, and usually that's kind of a two-way relationship where the data center is assisting with the relationship but isn't actually selling you the service. You're purchasing from someone else directly, like AT&T or Zayo or Level 3. And then you'll need to work out how they're going to hand off that fiber service to you. It's usually handed off with a fiber line. And I actually have, let me pull up my picture here of that. Yeah.
So the commercial building,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about many commercial buildings, say like a mom-and-pop store.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying commercial building with a specific type of business in mind. Is it like a telecom dedicated, a commercial building that's dedicated to telecom, or what kind of commercial building?
So yeah, good question. So the question is, if you're looking at a commercial building, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying you find a commercial building and you're trying to determine whether or not they might have fiber already there, and how do you know if that's the type of building?
And why would they have that?
And why?
fiber there?
Sure, okay. Yeah, it's a good question, and there's not a perfect answer, unfortunately. The answer is, if the fiber company thought that it was profitable to put fiber in there, then they did. And so, unfortunately, not a straightforward answer. The reasons can be somebody in that building already ordered fiber for their own needs, and then the company would have built it out, put it in, and could pretty easily expand it to include you. So that's not uncommon for like a business park type building, you know, like a high-rise office building. It's not unheard of for a mom and pop store to have that, but less common. The other answer, though, is that it's quite common for fiber providers to run their, you know, they run their fibers down the streets usually, and part of their infrastructure, they have pedestals and stuff where they can serve their equipment. If that pedestal of theirs is near a building, then even if somebody hasn't bought it yet in that building, it's pretty easy to get from the pedestal to the building. So that's the other thing. If you know, every company does it a little bit differently, so you have to kind of get familiar with the companies in the area and what their infrastructure is like. But if you can start to notice their pedestals and their infrastructure stuff in the streets, then you know what buildings are close to that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
An actual picture of the pedestal?
Let me, you know what, yeah, that's a good question. Well, yeah, let's find that. They vary a lot, so it's hard to, you know, but I'll find a couple examples. Okay, here's an example. Let me make that a little bigger. It's kind of hard to read, but here's an example of something you might see. And if you look, you'll probably start to see things that look something like this. They are usually this kind of bright color of orange, and you'll see them just along highways and freeways, and sometimes even city streets. Probably hard to read, but if you're up close, you can actually see this particular one is Zayo, and I can see their name here. So I noticed it, got out of the car, went and took a look, and then it's got their name and phone number on it. And so it means there's a pretty good chance that if I wanted to buy service near this thing, that I would still have to pay some money for them to get it from here to wherever I want it to go, but at least they wouldn't have to, dig up streets through the whole city to get there. So that's one example. I see these a lot, so you'll probably see something that looks like that in at least in the U.S. and whatever area you're in. Yeah.
So just a question about, you started out saying if you want to start this, you need to negotiate with a major ISP, at least online, and then also the data center needs space, et cetera. Are those two separate steps, or do data centers kind of have some sort of, can they negotiate on your behalf, or is there some sort of culmination of that?
Good question. So the question is, if you're using a data center, then you have to negotiate with the data center for space at the data center, et cetera. You also need to negotiate for fiber connection to the internet. Are those steps separate, or can they be combined? The answer is, in some cases, they can be combined. In some cases, the data center will sell you directly. They kind of call it their own, they act as their own internet service provider, but usually what that means is that they are offering a service on top of what these other providers are offering. So they're taking the providers that are already in the building. Maybe they're adding some redundancy for you, or some managed services for you, and then they're selling that to you as a package. Excuse me. I've normally found that that's quite a bit more expensive than dealing directly with the ISPs that are already in the building. So I typically don't go that way, just because you can save $500 a month right off the bat by just going directly. But it is a little bit more work to deal with them directly. So, yeah.
When you're talking about expense for something like a data center, are we talking tens of thousands a month? Or?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, how much exactly do these things cost, really, right? So it varies a lot, again, from place to place. But for just the space in the data center, it's depending on where you are and how big of a cabinet you get, and what you are able to negotiate for rooftop lease space, which you'll probably need also. It'll probably range from $500 at the really low end to maybe $1,500 or $2,000 a month. And then for your internet service, usually, a lot of the things that I've done, we usually start at about 1 gigabit of service. We buy a gigabit circuit. You can certainly buy circuits that are smaller than that, but that's a good kind of price point to understand where that price is. And that's usually for a full gigabit link from these providers we've talked about, depending on your area, is usually $800 to maybe $2,500 a month.
I was wondering if you could sort of explain some of the terminology. I'm looking here at this quote from Hurricane Electric, and it talks about burstable, and then it also talks about gig E versus transits, and so some of maybe those opaque terminology.
Yeah, for sure. So we asked here about some of the terminology that goes into negotiating your fiber circuit with the provider. I'm actually going to go back to this other slide that I had that has some of this in it. Here we go. Okay, so when you call a fiber provider and start asking about internet service, they're going to pepper you with a bunch of questions that have some kind of opaque terminology. I'm just going to assume for the conversation that we're asking about getting 1 gigabit of service. That may not be right for you in your community. Maybe you can do with less, or maybe you need a lot more, but I think that's an easy place to start the conversation. So when you call CenturyLink or Zayo or whoever, the thing to ask for is a gigabit of dedicated internet access. And there's a couple of important distinctions there. One is that a product that a lot of these companies will sell you is a point-to-point circuit. And a lot of times they don't really know what it is that you're after, so you kind of have to understand that so that they don't try to sell you that, because that's, in most cases, not what you need. What that means, a point-to-point circuit means, I have my business over here in this city, and I have another satellite office over in this city, and I want a gigabit connection between them so that we can share files and do video conferencing and whatever. So I want a point over here and a point over here, and they talk to each other, but they don't go out to the internet. Sometimes you might want that as you expand your network. Maybe you already have a connection at a data center and you want a point-to-point from that data center to somewhere else. But when you're just getting started, what you really want is a connection to the internet. So you'll ask for a dedicated internet access connection. The other things that they're going to ask about are, one of them is committed rate versus burstable rate. If you buy the committed rate is essentially what they should always be giving you no matter what. You should always, at any time of day, be able to test that connection and get that committed rate. So if you buy, for example, let's say you bought a circuit that had a 500 megabit per second committed rate, burstable to a gigabit. That means that 500 should be reserved for you and only you, but above that 500 you're sharing with other people. So what that would mean in practice is that during slow times of the day, late at night, early in the morning, or late morning, you might be able to hit that full gigabit, but during peak times of the day when other people are using their circuits, you might only get 500 megabits. It also means, usually what that means is that you pay extra if you burst over that 500 megabits. So usually you're negotiating a rate that is, I'm buying 500 megabits all the time, but the provider is going to watch how much you use, and they're going to bill you more, and they'll arrange with you how the billing is done, but they're going to bill you more if you go over the 500 megabits. And it, yeah.
I got a quote that had a flat rate for 300 committed or 600 for burstable. So how would that work when it's a flat rate for the burstable?
So they didn't have a 95th percentile usage above the 300 megabit?
Maybe I didn't get the actual terms and conditions.
Okay.
It was just over the phone.
Okay. So usually what that means, and a lot of providers kind of throw around different terminology. Usually what that means, the question was, he got a quote for 300 megabit committed, 600 megabit burstable, right? And it was...
Sorry, it was both for a gigabit, but the burstable would be to 10 gigabit.
Okay, I'm
Sorry, gigabit committed,
gigabit committed,
10 gigabit burstable.
right.
But the price was 300 a month.
Oh, I see.
600 a month for burstable.
Okay. Okay, so the question again is gigabit committed rate, 10 gig burstable, $300 a month for the gigabit, which is really good, really good.
Cogent.
Yeah, even for Cogent, that's really good. And 600 flat for 10 gigabit burstable. I can't say exactly what they're quoting without looking at the terms. That might just mean if you're using the 10 gigabit all the time, it'll be $600 a month. If you're using less than that, it'll be somewhere between 300 and 600. That might be what it means. But I have to look at it now for sure. Yeah. Usually the way that works is they bill you based on your 95th percentile usage. So if you're buying a gigabit, but your 95th percentile usage is 2.5 gigabits, then they bill you at 2.5 gigabits.
What's a 95th percentile usage?
Yeah, good question. What's the 95th percentile usage? So that's the amount, the rate that your circuit was using 95% of the time or less. Does that make sense?
I'm gonna say it again.
One more time. 95th percentile rate usage, because a lot of fiber companies will bill based on this. 95th percentile usage is the amount, the rate of throughput that your circuit is using 95% of the time or less.
So that allows for like large spikes that don't happen very often.
Right, exactly. That allows for large spikes that don't happen very often without being billed for them. But the more you use, the more you'll be billed.
And that's for the burstable part, but
That's for the burstable part.
Committed to paying the committee.
You committed to paying the committed. That's for the burstable part. Yeah. Yep. So moving along and hitting some of this other terminology that you might encounter. We hit burstable versus committed. We talked about point-to-point versus internet access. Another thing that you're going to run into, especially with companies that also sell service directly to residential or commercial customers, is that most of them have a clause in their agreements that doesn't allow that circuit to be used to be shared. So if, for example, if you go to buy a circuit from Comcast, they do sell this type of connection, like a gigabit committed connection on a fiber line, but there's probably a clause somewhere in the agreement, and you got to watch really carefully for this because the salespeople a lot of the time don't know. There is probably a clause that says that you can't resell that service. Obviously, you're welcome to risk it if you want, but just putting it out there that, you know, if that clause is in there, that's some risk that you're taking on. So companies like Cogent or Zayo or Level 3 that don't usually sell to residential customers or to like mom and pop commercial customers are less likely to have that clause in there, or at least more likely to get rid of it if you ask them to. But companies like AT&T and Comcast and Verizon that sell directly to customers will a lot of the time have a no resell clause. So you got to watch for that. Was a question?
I mean, it's a little bit changing subject, but I was super curious about like the tower stuff. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we actually have a whole section dedicated to the towers. So I think I'm going to hold off until then, just so that we can make sure we cover everything here. You're just asking about commercial towers and how that works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, there is a whole section on commercial towers, so we'll hit that. Yeah, I think it's tomorrow. Yeah. Good question though. Yeah.
I have a question. So basically, as far as the communication, right, a lot of these backhaul service providers, they're used to dealing with bigger organizations, and they have a method of business communication, right? If you're calling as an individual, sometimes there's some challenges there. So what is your advice to how you communicate with them? Like, for example, I think once I called one of them and they were asking, do I have a business sales department, you know, all these questions. And I just wanted to find out what their rates are.
Yeah.
So what advice can you give us on making ourselves look, I guess, appealing to them so that we can at least get the information we need from them?
Yeah, good question. So the question for the mic is, and this is true, these companies are mostly accustomed to dealing with large organizations, dealing with each other, or companies of similar size to themselves. And as an individual or as a very small organization, it can be intimidating to contact them, and a lot of the times just things are missed in communication, right? They're accustomed to dealing with something else, and they don't really know how to deal with you, and we don't really know how to deal with them. Is that your question? Yeah, and that's a good question. So a couple of things I would point out. One is that I think that knowing what you're asking for and understanding the terminology that they're going to use goes a long way. So hopefully this is helpful in that we can, if you're asking the questions that they're expecting, I think that actually goes a long way. The other thing is that their sales departments, I think, do more often than we might think deal with smaller organizations. Like a small mom and pop shop that just needs a bigger internet service connection or something, they're calling these same people too. So positioning yourself in that kind of similar small business mindset can also help, I think. My experience has been that if you get with the salespeople, they're anxious to sell to you. So usually they'll try to help, but they don't always know exactly what the terminology means either. So if you're not able to help them understand exactly what it is that you need, then sometimes communication breaks down. Does that help, or am I hitting?
So you're saying appear more as a small business than an individual just trying to find information?
I think so. I think that's more helpful.
Okay.
telling them exactly what it is that you're trying to do, even though sometimes that is intimidating because you don't want to give the impression that if you're calling Comcast, you don't necessarily want to say, hey, I'm trying to go get everybody off Comcast. But my experience with that, even though, has been that the people at Comcast who sell these big connections are more than happy to sell to you because they don't care if the residential service, they're not getting paid based on the residential service people, right? The salespeople selling these things they just get your commission, and that's what they want to do. So, yeah.
Where would you find, like, obviously you said that on the polls or whatever you could see the phone number, but where
Yeah.
else might you find information on how
Yeah.
to contact these people?
So the question is just how to find out how to contact these people. The sales department. It's usually just so the keywords to look for are their business internet connections, and usually that's a separate sales department than the residential ones, and usually that's the right one to start with to start asking for dedicated internet access. Yeah.
I'll just mention, when I was looking at this in Vancouver, I looked up the data center,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had a list on their website of all the carriers that
Yeah.
were in there. So then
Yeah.
you can just go through and say, okay, I can
Yeah.
call each one of these carriers or go to their website and say, hey, you
Yeah.
have a connection in the data center in my town. What is it going to cost to get a connection to that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just for the mic, looking at data centers in your area, a lot of times they will list what providers they provide in the data center. And so you can start calling them directly. The other thing is that if they're in the data center, it's a decent sign that they have a good presence in the area as well. So they might be good ones to call, even if you want it somewhere else, not at the data center, to see what else they have available. Yeah.
If I can offer part of the answer to this question about how do you get them to take you more seriously,
Yeah.
generally understanding how a sales pipeline works, as in if you just call up, you're at the top of the pipeline, they're not paying you a lot of attention. If you call up, get a few answers, follow up with the same person or somebody farther into the pipeline at a regular timeline, be honest about the other companies you're talking to, what service you're looking for, the timeline you're looking for, and the closer your timeline looks to the type of sales cycle they're looking for, the more likely you are to get quicker callbacks in general, whether you're buying this or any product. Just understand the general sales pipeline that corporations use to track their salespeople. That's their numbers. When we're in technology, it's what did we deliver. For salespeople, it's what did I sell? And different companies have different timelines, but the general pipeline works in a similar way. Just do a little reading on basic pipeline and follow the behavior as a customer that they want you to follow. Something that you're narrowing from just curious to closing on a deal, including, like, say, the part about being honest about the fact that you're looking at their competitors and what your timeline is. If your timeline's a year out, don't tell them it's 6 weeks out. Because at 10 weeks when you're still calling, you're just wasting their time. If you tell them it's a year out, they'll give you appropriate responses, and they won't be impatient with you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Just to summarize for the mic, understanding the sales pipeline and giving them honest questions, honest answers, and trying to fit yourself into their model helps. And the other big thing is just remember that they're salespeople and they're paid on commission. And if you buy something from them, they make money. And so they in that sense, kind of are working for you, right? And it's okay to make them work for you and let them know that you're looking at other providers, let them know what you're looking for, and they really want your business as long as they think it's a serious opportunity. Jumping from that, a couple other things you're going to look for as you're negotiating these contracts. One thing is that the big risk that you will end up probably having to take is that these are usually quite long-term contracts, 5 to 10 years. That can be a tough pill to swallow as a small organization just getting started to have that kind of commitment for that long. But I haven't seen a provider break on that term contract. They usually will want that 5 to 10 years. So that can be difficult. If we have time at the end, I'll throw out some other kind of creative options for that. But just to get to this, because this can be a difficult thing, I think, when you're first getting started. Once you've negotiated and you're ready to purchase, you've negotiated the committed rate that you'd like, you've negotiated the burstable rate that you would like, you have the right place and you're ready to go, the next kind of things they'll start asking about is what kind of handoff do you want? Basically that means how do you want us to deliver this to you? And that can be a little bit tricky to negotiate. Usually these are examples of different styles of fiber connector. Some of you might recognize these, maybe some of you don't, that's fine. And so if you're buying a fiber connection, usually they're going to give you basically a cable, and the end of it is going to look something like this. If you're buying an Ethernet connection, I think we're probably mostly more familiar with those. And you can ask them for Ethernet handoff. Ethernet handoff is convenient because all of our equipment already supports Ethernet. The downside is that they usually won't provide more than a gigabit of service on an Ethernet connection. So if you think you're ever going to need more than a gig, it's usually best just to have the handoff be fiber originally, and then it's less of a pain to upgrade later. I'm not going to run through each of these individually, just to say I think most common for what we're trying to do is this one in the top right called LC. I usually just ask for LC handoffs. In this picture, it only shows one, but it always comes as two. They come in a pair. They're TX and RX, so one of them sends, the other one receives. So you would get basically two of those from the yeah. Oh, I don't know. Question is, what does LC stand for? And I don't know. Does anybody know?
It's something along the lines of low control or something like that. It has to do with the bounce that you're getting.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I don't know.
It's been like 5 years, so I'm probably
Good question. I'll try to remember to look it up later. But yeah, I usually ask for LC connectors. And the other thing that they will ask is what type of fiber you would like, single mode fiber or multi-mode fiber. There are some important distinctions. We can get into them, but I think right here I'm just going to say the industry seems to be standardizing on single mode, and so it's, in my experience, usually easier to just always ask for single mode. It's what?
Lucent connector.
Lucent?
Lucent technology.
Oh, okay. Lucent, LC stands for Lucent Connector. There you go. Thank you.
SC standard.
Yeah. Yeah, so this one down here is the standard connector. It's hard to tell in the picture, but these ones are actually quite a bit bigger than the LC, if I remember correctly. So yeah, so those are some of the next things that you'll negotiate as you do this. The handoff. Let's see, we hit connect. So they'll want connector type. They'll want fiber type, which again would be usually single mode. And they'll also want media rate, meaning, yeah.
It's single mode and one other mode. What was the other?
Oh, the other one's multi-mode, single mode and multi-mode. But yeah, I typically just ask for single mode. They both will support easily up to 10 gigabits per second. You can, if you're ordering a 1 gigabit circuit, they'll usually give you a circuit that on the other end can only do 1 gigabit. But if you're ordering a circuit that is burstable to 10 gig, then they'll give you a 10 gigabit circuit. That matters because where you connect it into your server, you need to have a 1 gig or a 10 gigabit capable port. So if you're going for 10 gig, you kind of have to plan ahead for that. If you're going for 1 gig, then you can just get the 1 gig hardware. That makes sense. Yeah.
How hard is it to like upgrade later? I mean, are they pretty willing to go ahead and sell you more?
Yeah, good question. So question, how hard is it to upgrade later? At a data center, it's usually really easy to upgrade later because they already have all the infrastructure, and at most they need to do a little bit of service there on site, and you're up to 10 gig. Out anywhere else, out in the city or out at a building somewhere else, they may not have built 10 gig infrastructure to that building, and so it may be really, really difficult or even impossible to go from 1 gig to 10 gig. So it depends on where you are and what exactly you're trying to do, how hard it is to upgrade.
Do the data centers ever furnish the actual hardware for you, or do you always have to sort of order it yourself?
Yeah, good question. The question is, do the data centers furnish the hardware for you? So usually the data center will give you that end. So they'll get that end all the way into your cabinet, and the hardware from that point beyond is on them. but you furnish the server it plugs into and the connector it plugs into, typically.
Like a recommended server.
That would probably come from the Althea folks, something that will, any server.
We're gonna have a recommended probably Supermicro machine, and then it just needs a fiber card. We're talking about maybe $1,000 if you want something good that'll last a long time. If you really want it to be cheap, you could put a used desktop in there and slap a cheap fiber card in there and probably get away under $300, and it would still perform okay. But especially for something that you're going to use for backhaul, you want like the redundant power supplies, et cetera, et cetera. You can get cheeky and just have 2 gateways in there and let Althea do the failover for you. But the data center may start looking at you funny if you cart in beat up used desktops and try and put them in the rack. So.
In my experience, they don't care.
Okay, cool.
You're buying it from them, they don't care.
Yeah, so the cost of the hardware is pretty trivial compared to the cost of the service. Don't really worry about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Once you're trying to push 10 gig, it can get a little harder to get something that works. But usually it's a while from when you get started until you are needing 10 gig.
So do the data center go into like power utilization and space as well? Like I'm assuming the smaller space you have on the rack, the cheaper you might pay, which in that case maybe a desktop solution might not
Good question.
appealing. So do they go into, I guess does the power consumption and space, does that impact how much you pay?
Good question. So the question is, does the power consumption that your servers and equipment use, and also the space in the cabinet, how much can you save by minimizing both of those things? Is that right? Okay. So a couple of things here. One, my experience with the data centers I've worked with, a lot of them, the smallest rack you can rent, the smallest space you can rent is a full rack, or sometimes maybe a half a rack, which is like this, and they won't actually rent you anything smaller than that. So again, like I said, a lot of times you end up with this one tiny little thing in all this space, but that's the smallest that they'll go. You can negotiate that with the data center. A lot of data centers are different. Some will rent you just a teeny tiny little cabinet. I just haven't personally worked with ones like that very much. So if they do that, you might be able to save some money by negotiating a really small cabinet space. With the power, they do bill you for the power that you use. It usually ends up being a very tiny amount of the total cost that you're paying, maybe like $30 or $40 a month or something, maybe only 20. So even if you're using a lot, it probably won't save you more than a few dollars a month, I guess. But every little bit helps, right?
So I remember earlier when someone asked about like your average cost for everything, holistically, I think you mentioned on the higher end, like let's say 2,000.
Yeah.
Would that include, does that include your power utilization, your space, and the service and all of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that would not include the service. So you'd probably be paying, if you go to a data center and altogether for the rack, roof space, and a fiber connection, I would expect that to be, it really depends on your area again, but anywhere from like $1,500 to maybe like $3,500 a month altogether. Good question. Okay, so 15 minutes left. I'm going to try to hit a couple more things. One, I just wanted to point out, I've used this a lot before. This is a great resource. It's called fiberlocator.com. I don't have any relationship with them. It's just a helpful tool. And it has fiber maps from a lot of different providers. Not all different providers, but from a lot of different providers. It can be really helpful as you start to expand your network and need to find new places where fiber already exists. It is kind of expensive though. I think a few $1,000s a year. So it probably only makes sense once you're somewhat established and looking to maybe expand networks or whatever. Or if you want to pool together in some kind of community way and get access to it or whatever. But it can be really helpful in kind of the first parts of the search.
What is the free trial for?
Oh, I don't know. Good question. I don't know. Yeah. There's a couple other sites like this too. This is just the one I've used the most. So that's helpful. Another thing I wanted to point out is that sometimes you can purchase from other types of organizations, like, for example, another wireless internet service provider. I know a lot of providers, especially in more rural areas, who have gone to a neighboring county or a neighboring city and found the kind of local wireless provider or the local provider, and purchased directly from them. The benefit is that they're a smaller provider. They're local. They understand what you're trying to do, and while you might end up paying more, probably they're also more willing to have a shorter term with you, and so you might be able to go to Bob's internet service from the county next door and pay him $500 a month for a 100 megabit connection, and he'll help you set it up and get it working, and only put you in a year contract or something. Yeah.
Could you touch on oversale for consumer versus dedicated connections?
Yeah. Oversell, you mean how much do you need to service a certain number of customers? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay, good question. Okay, yeah, I do have a.
And also the fact that you're paying for a connection that's not oversold specifically.
Right. Right. Yeah. Good question. Okay, so the question is about oversell in two ways. One, that you should be buying a connection that isn't oversold, really, and two, how much do you need to provide service to a certain number of customers? So the answer to that, we talked about committed rates, and that's really when you buy a connection from somebody, you should be asking them for the committed rate, and they really should be giving it to you. And you should probably be checking that once in a while to make sure they really are delivering that committed rate. Althea's service will help with that, with running the automated throughput tests. If you can kind of be watching that and making sure that it matches up with what you're purchasing. Because there are some kind of budget providers, Cogent, that will sometimes not deliver everything that you're paying for. And if you hound them about it, they'll fix it. But they're a business like everybody, and things fall through the cracks and whatever. The next question, I think this is an important question that a lot of people wonder about, especially at the beginning, is how much internet service do you need to buy or do you need to get for your community to be able to provide good service? And it's hard to know exactly. It varies a little bit, and there's no exact math to it. I did put a little chart together. Okay, here we go. So the question is, I've got my community, a rural community or a city center or whatever it is, and I know I've got X number of people who might be using the service. How much of a connection do I need to go buy to go give them service that's not going to really be awful in the evenings when everybody's streaming Netflix, right? It's not an exact math. This is kind of the high-level numbers that I use. Basically, for a few dozen customers, you might need something like 150 megabits. For ramping up to hundreds, you get pretty quickly to where you need at least a gigabit. For somewhere between like 250 to maybe 500 customers, you're going to need a gigabit of service. And going beyond that, you start needing to burst up to 10 gigabit.
So, for reference, most ISPs like to sell you a speed, specifically because they can sell that speed many times. For example, my apartment building sells everybody gigabit. There are 300 units in the apartment building. There's only a 2 gigabit line to the building. So the oversale ratio is quite large. Selling a given speed or like a given connection 20 times is considered to be the like rule of thumb. But in reality, especially coaxial networks, like for example, if you were buying internet from Comcast over cable, your real oversale rate is probably closer to 100, to like 100 to 1, perhaps greater. And this is why you don't want to use consumer connections as backhaul, other than the fact that Comcast will come after you, is the fact that you will really see the impact of this oversale. Try doing a speed, so don't do a speed test, use fast.com, which connects directly to Netflix, so you can't throttle it without throttling Netflix. So speedtest.net, you'll notice, will always get full speed, day in, day out, anytime. And that's because you actually slow down everyone else's Netflix when you use it. If you go to fast.com, you'll get your real internet speed, and you'll notice that this curves with people's usage. For reference, you probably want 4 megabits for everyone when you divide it out, because 4 megabits is HD Netflix. If everybody on your network can get 4 megabits at once, everyone will be happy.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah.
This may be a little bit off topic, but do you have any personal experience in terms of retention rates for internet plans? Like how often do
Yeah.
they change?
Yeah, good question. The question is retention rates. How often do people change their internet service, right? Most of the places I've worked, we've seen anywhere from like 0.5% to 1.5% of churn rate, meaning somewhere around 1% of the customers will cancel every month, which I think if you do the math ends up being they're keeping their service for anywhere from like 4 to 20 years typically. And that really does depend on, I mean, a lot of that is just people moving or whatever, but you definitely will see those churn rates creep up if the speed isn't good or if the price isn't good or if the reliability. The 3 things people care about: price, speed, and reliability, largely in that order. Maybe reverse order.
Yeah, it's in reverse order. People care about reliability ahead of anything
Yeah.
else. So for quick reference, 99% uptime means you're down almost 72 hours a month. 99.9% uptime is 3 hours a month. You need 99.999% uptime before people no longer notice that anything's going wrong. Now, the cool thing about Althea is that it emulates a lot of the more complex wireless ISP setups. If you have 2 connections, it will load balance, it will reallocate traffic, it will move things around and make sure it's online. And you'll go to conferences with serious wireless ISPs and they have trouble doing some of the stuff that Althea does automatically out of the box for you, as far as making sure that the network is as reliable and fast as possible. So you can take advantage. So if you have two boxes north of somebody and they're both on only 80% of the time, and 80% as we established is horrible. 99% as we established is still too bad. But if they're both on 80% of the time and fail independently, then you'll be up to that 99.9% because because it becomes a chance of a simultaneous failure. And if I had the whiteboard and I was willing to think about it for a few seconds, we could do the probability math, and I'll do that later.
During lunchtime, if you
Okay.
want. We're
Yeah.
probably going to wrap it up. if
Yeah,
you want.
yeah. There's just a few more minutes. Any other questions about fiber?
Yes, so, just to get clear, so for example, let's say for ease of conversation, you're buying service at 200 megabits. Now, if you're selling that to 20 customers, you're not just able to sell 2 megabits per customer? Is it a straight division?
No. Yeah, okay, good question. So it's kind of hard to keep all these things straight. So if you're buying 100 megabits from somebody, the first thing to know is that you should be buying 100 megabits committed rate. What that means is that if you go to Comcast residential service and you buy their connection that says 100 megabits, that is not a 100 megabit committed rate. You may sometimes get 100 megabits from Comcast on that connection, but you're sharing that 100 megabits with 50 other people, and so you won't always get that 100 megabits. So it's important to make that distinction. I think that's what we were trying to talk about here, is that residential products are almost never sold as committed rates. They're always a burstable rate, and the committed rate is actually much lower. So that's kind of the top level thing. So if you were to go to your customers, you could, if you wanted, position a product and say, hey, I have 2 megabits for you that is only yours and no one else will ever use it. And maybe that customer base really appreciates that. And so you certainly could do that. But what most people do is sell basically what's the average rate that each of my customers are actually going to see. And so if you have 100 megabit connection and you put 20 customers on it, the internet traffic from those 20 customers ends up being really spiky They hit a web page, and what they use spikes way up for a very brief amount of time, and then spikes right back down. So what happens is that all of those customers, because of the probabilities of their usage, end up each individually able to browse the internet, and it feels good. Maybe they can even watch movies and whatever. And because they're not all using it at the same time, they can, on average, get a lot faster speeds than the 2 megabits per second. So you can go in and say, hey, I have these 20 customers. I've been watching their service. I know what they're experiencing. Most of the time, they actually get about 20 megabits per second, or whatever that average ends up being. And you can go ahead and sell that as a 20 megabit product, with the understanding that that's the way residential products are sold at kind of the average usage, not at an actual committed rate. That makes sense?
I'll just add to that really quickly that Althea doesn't provide, you generally won't be selling a speed. It's more, for consumer, more like a cell phone plan where you're selling a certain amount of data.
Sure. Yeah.
That's because we wanted to remove the like ultra high oversale incentive.
Right.
So, so your committed rate is going to be your maximum throughput divided by your number of customers?
Yeah.
And then the oversale would only apply to your burstable rate?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily have to be your burstable rate. Like your maximum burst speed could be like 10 GB, but you could sell a 2 megabit per second service to like 100 customers, something like that.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could position it however you'd like. If you really wanted to get into doing that, you would want some other controls in there, because you would have to actually limit everybody to that 2 megabits.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they would end up stepping on each other. But yeah, you could potentially do that if you wanted to.
Have you ever seen the backhaul providers sell service in terms of data rather than speed?
Not directly, although if you back out from the 95th percentile burstable rate, that's kind of where you end up. So, because, but yeah, not directly. I haven't seen them directly sell or directly bill based on bits passed. They usually bill based on 95th percentile throughput.
Should we break?
Yeah.
All right, everybody here at 1. On your sheet, it has some suggestions for lunch. There's a little cafe nearby, or you can walk. And then we'll see you all back here at 1.
I feel like ramen.
Thank you.